Hello and welcome to Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix, your host. I'm a representative in the Salem area, and I appreciate your joining us for discussions about leaders in our capital and issues in our capital. Capital Insight comes to you as an opportunity for all of us to develop a little more insight in how state government operates. Our guest today is John Lattimer. He is the Legislative Fiscal Officer for the Oregon Legislature. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome John to the show.
Thank you, Kevin. It's good to be here.
We're trying to develop this format so that we can talk a little bit about the background on individuals who are in state government, as well as develop some insight into them as people and develop some insight into the issues that surround them. I thought I'd start off with you by hearkening back, to your younger years. I know you came to Oregon in '88, and we'll talk about that, but what did you do before you came to Oregon?
Well, Kevin, I've spent most of my working years working for state legislatures. In fact, this is my fourth state legislature. I started out in the Kansas legislature working on the Joint Legislative Budget Committee. And I was working at that time on my PhD at the University of Kansas when I took what I thought was going to be a short-term job, and it ended up being a 22-year career so far working in state legislatures. I moved from there to the Ways and Means Committee with the Ohio legislature, and then left that after a couple years and went to Illinois, where I worked for 17 years for the Illinois General Assembly, doing primarily program evaluation, school finance, and a variety of things like that.
And you came to Oregon in 1988.
That's correct.
What brought you to Oregon?
The Great Northwest, among other things. I spent the last 22 years, I guess, trying to find my way to the Northwest. My wife is from Idaho, and we used to spend our summers out here. So I really enjoyed the area and had hoped someday to come here. I also knew a lot about Oregon with friends here who had moved out earlier, and had an appreciation for the way the Oregon legislature was organized and operated, and had a fascination with the Northwest and the politics of the Northwest, so I thought I'd like to give it a try.
Well, I'd like to pause for a moment and ask you about Kansas, Ohio, and Illinois as they compare to Oregon in terms of the legislative process. How do they break down or stand up or compare?
Well, all of our state legislatures, Kevin, are very different. One of the major differences in Oregon, I think, particularly compared to Illinois, is the lack of amending a bill on the floor. For our viewers, our audience, that's probably not something that most people think about, but when you do not amend a bill on the floor of the House or the Senate, you create very strong committees in the body. The committees themselves then are where most of the writing of the legislation takes place. In a state like Illinois, you have essentially an operation that I like to call a committee of the whole, where much legislation is actually crafted on the floor of the House or the Senate because of the amendment process. In fact, I have seen bills in the Illinois House with as many as 150 amendments queued up to go through the process. It takes a very long time. Members are in session for long, long hours in marathon sessions. Creates a very different dynamic in the politics of the legislative session.
My immediate reaction is I'd probably gag on that lack of efficiency in those other processes. We should mention that in Oregon, and the legislature, by its own rules and provisions, does not allow anyone to amend a bill on the floor. If you think a bill is flawed, fatally flawed, the most you can do is move to return it to committee and argue that maybe they can fix it there, and that motion is seldom successful, and it's not very often made.
That's true. It really creates a very different kind of process. One could argue that the process in other states that allows amendments on the floor allows more opportunity for a minority point of views to have their day in court, so to speak, to allow for the amendments on the floor. It's much more difficult in the smaller committee setting to have minority views access the amendment in the committee. I think, though, that in Oregon it works very well the way we operate. It's a much more efficient system, and it allows us, I think, to craft legislation and make it a better piece of legislation than perhaps we find in other states where there is this constant amendment process on the floor without attention to detail.
Well, let's shift a little bit now to your role as Legislative Fiscal Officer and try to develop some insight into that. What is the Legislative Fiscal Officer?
The Legislative Fiscal Officer provides staff for the Joint Ways and Means Committee of the legislature, and it provides the staff for the Emergency Board, which meets during the interim between sessions. We also provide staff to the full body by providing fiscal impact statements on all legislation that goes through the House and Senate. And we staff a variety of other committees, such as the Joint Data Processing Committee and the Joint Legislative Audit Committee.
Now, let me interrupt for a moment here then and point out then we have sessions that last about 6 months every 2 years, and then we have an interim of about 1.5 years. And when you talk about Joint Ways and Means, that is the joint committee that develops all of the budgets for all the agencies and proposes them to the House and the Senate. Now, as far as the fiscal impact statement goes, could you explain what that is, something that's attached to every bill?
Well, Kevin, this is something that that various legislators view both with pride and concern, depending on how they feel about the particular bill that's going through the House. But each bill, as it goes through the House, is reviewed by our staff on the fiscal staff to see whether or not it costs a state agency money to operate or to handle whatever the bill is trying to propose. Our staff look at those bills, work with state agencies to fashion the cost of that particular piece of legislation to the state agency or to the government as a whole. We also look at the cost of bills that affect local governments and school districts to see what the cost to those local units might be.
So you're able to try at least to address one of the big arguments that comes up is when you change substantive laws or you're imposing mandates, there are often hidden costs imposed on state agencies or on local governments, and it's your job and the job of your staff to make sure we know what those costs are.
That's correct.
Do other states do this? Or at least in terms of your experience with Kansas, Ohio, and Illinois?
Other states do it. They don't, in many states, they don't have the focus and the requirement in statute that we do that requires a fiscal impact on every piece of legislation.
Now, if we have a fiscal impact of a certain amount, it has to go to, the bill then has to go to Ways and Means for taking a look at appropriating the money, doesn't it?
That's correct, yes.
And is that level something like $50,000, or do you know what the level is?
Well, that level depends on the leadership of both the House and the Senate. There's no statutory level that requires a particular piece of legislation to go to the Ways and Means Committee for funding. In past years, there's been an unwritten rule that perhaps legislation costing $50,000 or more should go to Ways and Means. But that's merely a guideline. It's not a hard rule.
I'll mention to our audience that we're with Capital Insight, or you're with Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix, your host, and our guest today is John Lattimer, who is the Chief Legislative Fiscal Officer. And if you have any questions or concerns at any time, I hope you feel free to write to me at Capital Insight, H395, State Capitol, Salem, Oregon, 97310. And we'll pick right back up with John and a discussion of the fiscal process. When I was mentioning this $50,000 figure that you sort of confirmed informally has been sort of the rule of thumb about referral of bills to Ways and Means, I should have mentioned quickly that we're, of course, not talking about direct appropriations, but indirect costs of changes in the laws. And I want to clarify that because I hope folks don't think that we're just willy-nilly passing out bills that cost money and appropriating money that way. But on appropriations measures, can you give us some idea, a sketch of how the appropriations measures are dealt with during the session, how the budget is put together?
Well, I think, Kevin, it might be important for our audience to understand that the legislature operates on a budget proposed by the governor. The governor and her staff, through the Budget Management Division in the Executive Department, prepare a budget, and they're, for example, currently developing that budget for the 93 legislative session. It takes a long time for state agencies to put their budgets together, and they're just now formulating the final stages of that process. We receive that budget December 1st of the year preceding the legislative session. And when we receive that budget, our staff then analyze the budget of each agency and present an analysis of that to the legislature. Along with the budget, the governor introduces bills, or has introduced bills, that encompass the dollars that each agency then is seeking from the legislature. Some 120 or more pieces of legislation that appropriate money for state agencies. As those bills then are introduced, they're referred to the Ways and Means Committee, which is a joint committee. That means that both House and Senate members sit together to hold hearings on the legislation and to review the requests of the agencies for dollars to spend on state programs. Our job on the staff is to analyze each one of those requests and to make recommendations to the Ways and Means Committee as to whether or not the requests of the agencies meet the requirements of legislation or state law, the priorities of the legislature that have been established so far.
Now we're going through a process right now where we are halfway through a biennium, and I should mention that we budget on a 2-year basis since the legislature meets every 2 years. And in 1991, from January to June, our legislature was in session. We took a look at the financial projections for the next biennium, which started July 1 of 1991 and runs through the end of June of 1993. So here we are in July of 1992. We're halfway through the biennium. How do you project the amount of money that's going to be available for that whole 2-year period?
Kevin, it's very difficult. As you know, the economy can change, and because our revenues, particularly our general fund revenues, are based on the income tax, as the economy rises and falls, so do our revenues from the income tax. So sometimes it's difficult to estimate how much money we will have to spend, particularly on the general fund budget. The Executive Department of state government has a state economist, and that state economist's sole job primarily is to constantly watch the economy and to make estimates of revenues that we will have to spend. As you know, our job in Ways and Means and the legislature by Constitution is to balance the budget. So it's very important for us to know how much money we have to spend so that we don't appropriate more dollars than we have.
Now you have a counterpart who is the revenue officer for the legislature, and it's his job to worry about the incoming money and where it's going to come from, make sure that our legislation is moving smoothly on the revenue side. And your job is the expenditure side. Now, do you and the revenue guy get together and talk about this from time to time?
Yes, we do. In fact, our offices are right next door to each other, and we spend a great deal of time making sure that we are both in sync on how much revenue there is and how much we have to spend, particularly in school finance. As you know, Kevin, a great large portion of our state general fund budget goes to local schools, and the Revenue Committee fashions the formula that essentially sends the dollars to various school districts throughout the state. And because it's such a large portion of our general fund budget, we have to work very closely together to make sure that we are giving them the proper amount of funding, and not so much that we can't balance the budget.
Now, as we go through this process, can you give us some sort of well, first of all, I'll stop for a minute and say, as far as the process goes, you're working with various legislators. We've passed the appropriations for the biennium. Are those in place throughout those 2 years, or can you tell us a little bit about how the Emergency Board fits into this process?
Well, Kevin, I think there are some misunderstandings about the Emergency Board. The Emergency Board is established in the Constitution primarily to do just that, meet emergencies. The emergency board cannot appropriate dollars. It can only change the relative mix of dollars and expenditures in state agencies. However, there is an amount of money that's appropriated to the emergency board each session, and that the emergency board can allocate those dollars to meet those emergencies. For example, forest fires across the state, when we don't know for any one year what kind of a fire season we'll have. It's difficult to appropriate enough money to meet the fire season. So the emergency fund is there to take care of those kinds of unforeseen circumstances.
Sort of like handling the legislative PIN money for the biennium.
It's a large amount of PIN money, Kevin. It's about $48 million this time.
But that is money we've set aside for unanticipated contingencies but for things that are things that we can often project, but we don't know if there's going to be an earthquake tomorrow in Oregon creating an emergency, and we won't necessarily call the legislature back into session to deal with it if there's enough funds that have been appropriated to the emergency board for their allocation. Is that how it works?
That's correct. The emergency board can also move dollars around within a large agency. For example, the Department of Human Resources. It's very difficult because it is such a huge agency with a $1.4 billion general fund budget for them to always know what the caseload might be a year or year and a half down the road. The emergency board can rearrange those dollars within that budget to meet any kind of changes that might happen within the needs of the department.
All right, well, we're going to pause for a moment. Since we don't have any commercial interruptions, I'll mention to our audience that you're with us on Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem. Our guest today is John Lattimer, Chief Legislative Fiscal Officer. If you have any questions or comments at any time, I hope you'll write to me, Representative Kevin Mannix, at Capital Insight, H395, State Capitol, Salem, Oregon, 97310. Now we'll get back to the issues relating to spending the state's tax dollars. We had talked a little bit before we started the program today about the general expenditure picture, and I was wondering if you'd be willing to give us sort of a thumbnail sketch of the breakdown of where our money goes in the state budget process.
Well, Kevin, the state budget is really divided into three parts, and its total is $17 billion this current biennium. But of that $17 billion, only 5.6 is what we refer to as the general fund. And the general fund is what most people are concerned about because it's undedicated dollars that we can spend on just about anything we want. It's the general fund, for example, that funds our schools, our universities, our prisons, our human resource programs. And this is the fund that also must be used to take care of the Measure 5 dollars that are required to repay the lost property taxes at the for local school districts. The general fund budget is, although it's smaller than the others, the other two components of the total budget, which are federal funds, which are dedicated to various federal projects, mostly in human resources, Medicaid, ADC, and what we call other funds, which are funds generated from fee revenues as well as funds from bonds, for example, the Veterans Home Loan Program, a variety of things such as that. The Highway Fund, for example, is other funds. But those are dedicated to specific purposes. So when the governor calls the special session for this month, and the legislature will try to deal with raising revenue to take care of the Measure 5 problem, they're concerned primarily about the general fund. The general fund itself is misunderstood by many people in that they think that when we talk about cutting that fund or those dollars that are spent there, we always want to cut their favorite programs. Unfortunately, it's the general fund that pays for everyone's favorite programs. 93% of the general fund budget pays for public safety, education, and human resources. The all other, or about $400 million out of the $5.6 billion, pays for everything else. The Attorney General, the Governor's Office, the legislature, all of natural resources, those kinds of things. The rest of the large portion of the general fund, or 54% of it, goes directly to education. K through 12 schools, about 2.2, and community colleges, about 2.2 billion. So you can see that schools take up almost half the budget.
Let me interrupt you for a moment and ask you about a figure. And I should mention, neither of us has notes here, so this isn't like we're trying to pass a quiz in high school.
These are round numbers too, Kevin.
That's right. But we're trying to get into concepts here, and I often hear people saying, well, why don't you just take lottery money and fund education? Can you throw some figures at us about what we're really talking about in terms of lottery versus education?
The appropriation this biennium for K through 12 schools alone was 1.2 billion, 1.1 billion. Community colleges alone was $200 million. All of our natural resources agencies, $97 million. That's $97 million. We only receive from lottery for this biennium projected $100 million. That $100 million is not going to go very far in funding schools.
It would pay for half of the community college budget.
That's correct.
Period. End of discussion. Well, and I say that, I don't mean that we shouldn't discuss what to do with the lottery money, but it's not nearly as much as one would think in terms of the real needs. Well, we've been looking at the revenue side. Obviously, the legislature is going to be dealing with that based on the governor's proposals, and as we are preparing this program, we don't know whether or not there's going to be a vote coming up. But that isn't a direct concern of yours. It's a very strong indirect concern, I suppose, but you have to worry about where to allocate the money that is available, working with Ways and Means. And that shifts me around a bit to an area that I'm curious about. Can you give us some idea of the dynamics of how the House and Senate work together on this appropriations process, the Ways and Means Committee?
Well, the Ways and Means Committee it's a fascinating way to deal with legislation because it's about the only place that we have joint committees meeting. In fact, the Senate and the House work very closely together. The committee has a Senate chair and a House chair, so we have co-chairs of the Joint Ways and Means Committee, and those two chairs must get together and try to help fashion a balanced budget. So the Ways and Means Committee, which is divided up into 6 subcommittees with chairs, each one has its own chair. Those 6 chairs and the co-chairs will generally sit down and try to work out the parameters of the various budget policy areas within the budget. That's difficult to do because you have competing interests, as you know, between public safety and human resources and education and natural resources. And when you have a chair of a committee that's particularly concerned about natural resources, when most of the budget goes to education, they have to balance those needs, and it's a very interesting political process.
As part of that political process, there's always this balance between Ways and Means and all the other committees in the legislature, because Ways and Means gets to decide on the appropriations, and sometimes appropriations price tags are attached to other bills that come out of other committees. And yet, Ways and Means is not supposed to make substantive policy decisions. They're supposed to deal with just appropriating or funding programs. Now, realistically, we have to say that where the dollar goes, policy follows to some extent. But is there some distinction made or some attempt to differentiate between making substantive decisions about policy and funding in the Ways and Means process?
Well, Kevin, we try. We try not to create substantive policy in legislation. But as you said, the dollars do create policy on their own. We create policy in state government by making decisions about which programs will receive funding and which will not. When we receive substantive legislation in Ways and Means, we try very carefully not to amend that legislation other than to put needed dollars into it. But as you know, that doesn't always happen. Sometimes Ways and Means committees do try to fashion their own policy within the substance of the legislation.
Well, that's where the push-pull of the legislative process begins and ends, I suppose, is where the money is going to go. In terms of the revenue side, do you get a revenue picture from the Revenue Committee early on? Do they just say, well, we expect that this is the amount of revenue you'll have to deal with, besides what comes from the state's Chief Economics Officer?
Well, the Revenue Committee, every session is dealing with a lot of revenue bills that will change the relative amount of revenues that we might get. So they have to let us know when they are making, quote, revenue expenditures. In other words, when they're passing legislation that reduces revenue by adding something to the law that gives someone a tax preference, for example, that costs the state money. So we're constantly in contact to make sure that as they pass legislation that reduces revenue or increases revenue, we can put that into our equation for how much money we have to spend.
Let me throw a little zinger at you as we have about 3 minutes left. And the zinger is, it's a policy issue, but I'm curious about your input. One of the proposals has been that the legislature, when it goes into session in January, ought to appoint committees, organize itself and all of that, and then defer heavy action on a lot of appropriations bills. Just have the Ways and Means Committee perhaps actively operating and other committees just working on their committee legislation. But send a lot of people home, except for perhaps every once a month for a while, until we have a better idea what the budget picture ought to be, and then bring everybody back at some later time, say June or September or whenever, which may require a change in fiscal years. What is your reaction to that?
Well, Kevin, I think that it's not a bad idea. I think it's something that we may want to look at. As you know, we base our budget on the May forecast that is given to us by the Executive Department of revenues that we will have for the next biennium. Consequently, when we come in January, we have all that time until May to work on legislation and to work on budgets. What typically happens is that we tend to work on very small budgets, on budgets that are other funded or use dedicated funds rather than general fund, and we really don't get to the big dollar budgets, education, K through 12, higher ed, human resources, until as late as June. So to give us an opportunity to work on a total budget, and given the time to do that rather than just dealing with pieces of the budget over time, I think might provide us with a better process.
Have we given thought to using an earlier economic forecast rather than the May one as the basis for our budget?
We could do that. There's nothing that says that the May forecast is sacrosanct. What happened, though, as you will remember, the December forecast in 1989, going into the 91 session, gave us much to worry about because we thought we were going to have to cut budgets. And then as the economy began to rise, we found by May that we had more dollars to spend than we thought we had.
So we kind of want to wait and always see what the last best shot is in terms of the financing.
I think that's true, yes.
Well, John, we've kind of wrapped up our time today. I really appreciate your joining us to develop a little more, help us develop a little more insight into how we budget for our state expenditures. And I'd like to thank our audience for joining us on Capital Insight. I'm Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, your host. I appreciate your joining us. I, again, appreciate John joining us. If you ever have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to write. Thank you for joining us.